This program was produced by the Chemical Heritage Foundation. Our mission is to collect, preserve, and make known the history of chemistry, chemical engineering, and related sciences and technologies.
Hello and welcome to Distillations, a live conversation about science, culture and history. I'm Michal Meyer, a historian of science and editor of Chemical Heritage magazine here at CHF.
And I'm Bob Kenworthy. I'm a chemist and I'm also here at CHF. Our program today is Intoxication and Civilization, Beer's Ancient Past. Welcome to our show. We're going to explore the history and science of beer, and it's one of my favorite programs because the product I love best and science, the subject I love best. What a show. Michal?
Well, thank you for that, Bob. I think I will introduce our guest now. Our guest tonight, Patrick McGovern, who is known as the beer archaeologist. He also has a more formal title. He is the scientific director of the University of Pennsylvania's Biomolecular Archaeology Project. I'm glad I got that out. Welcome.
Very good.
And our other guest is Roger Barth, who is a chemist, a chemistry professor at Westchester University, and a home brewer as well. Welcome to the show. Well, tonight I am surrounded by chemists. You planned this, Bob, didn't you?
It's about time.
Well, I have my secret weapon. I have a timer, my bubble timer. So if there's too much intense chemistry, I'm going to be turning this over and starting the countdown. So beware.
And what happens if we run overtime?
My next secret weapon. Have a beer.
So this is really a drinking game. This usually isn't a show, right?
Well, we're going to try and keep it as a show, certainly. And in the meantime, I would like to remind viewers that you can ask our guests questions on Twitter by using the hashtag SciCulture. You can also send us questions on our blog, our Tumblr blog, and that is chemheritage.tumblr.com.
So let me get it started. You're both scientists, okay? And you're beer brewers and beer connoisseurs. So in turn, tell us how you became interested in beer. Pat, why don't you go first?
Okay, well, it started when I was a little bit underage, you could say, at 16 years old, when I went on a trip to Germany, to Munich. In fact, the first night I had dinner in Munich with a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Peter Debye. And it just turned out that then we took a trip down through the Alps, and at first I was drinking Coca-Cola because that's the American drink, right? And then I discovered that beer was less expensive than Coke, and so at dinners we would generally have 1 liter, helles oder dunkles, and then of course by the time our food arrived we would have to have noch 1 liter. And by the time we were finished, the waiter would come and ask me, well, what did I have for dinner? And of course, by that time, with 2 liters of beer, I was feeling, pretty good. So I sometimes had trouble remembering it. So that was my greatest challenge on that trip.
And that's how you came to love beer, right?
But it fed right back into later when we had samples brought to us of ancient beer that we did the analysis on.
Okay, great. Roger, what got you into beer?
Well, I had an interest in sort of the process, and my children bought me a Mr. Beer, which is a cute little beer making kit, and it has a plastic keg, 2 gallons, and that's the fermenter, and that's what you make the beer in. And I made some beer. It was kind of cute, and so. But you had the supplies for beer normally come for batches of 5 gallons, so I started making 5-gallon batches. And I'm making beer, and it's getting a little better, and I'm thinking, we're always looking for ways to get students involved in chemistry so they don't take like geology or something. And so I thought, what if I could teach a course about this? And you know, students are generally known to be very interested in two things, and we thought we'd go with the second one. And so I wrote a little tape-bound book, and it took off. We got 75 people in the class every semester, right? So it's 150 people a year are being exposed to chemistry, and it's really interesting chemistry. And it's, you know, we talk about packaging, so we get really a lot of aspects of chemistry in there. So
And this is on a dry campus.
yeah, it's we do go on a brewery tour, and the kids that are over 21, you know, can sometimes get some samples. At least I hope they're over 21. And but the students enjoy it, and and some of them actually take up brewing, and I hope they don't like stick pins and dolls of me or something, you know, when they make that their career. It's a hard way to make a living.
And it has been for quite a while a hard way to make a living, but we'll get more into that
Yes.
in a little bit.
Yeah, I want to, Pat, I want to ask you now about the history. You're the archaeologist of beer. Can you take us back to the beginning, the big bang of beer? When does the story of beer begin?
Well, in my book, Uncorking the Past, I really take it back to the Big Bang because there are massive clouds of alcohol in the star-forming regions of the Milky Way. You know, they're quadrillions of miles away, so we're not going to mine those anytime soon. But it's not just ethanol. You know, it's methanol, vinyl, alcohol, very reactive species. And then life on Earth, when you start thinking about it, fermentation is one of the basic processes for producing energy. So physiologically, many animals are attracted to alcohol, get energy from it, just like from sugar. And you know, whether you're a fruit fly or a human or a primate or an elephant or whatever, you are attracted to alcohol. And the plumes of alcohol have an aroma that will draw these animals to that. And then they have very similar mind-altering effects, even inebriation effects. Like the fruit fly has a lot of the same genes that humans do that involve drinking of alcohol, such as barfly is the name of one of them. Amnesiac is another.
That's
cheap
a
date.
good... I suspect it would have been a student that would have come up with these kind of names.
So, I mean, I don't think it's so strange then that humans, probably right from the beginning of our species in Africa, have been very much interested in alcoholic beverages, although we can't necessarily prove that because we don't have the containers to do the chemical analyses.
But you would assert that animal behavior and the study of animal behavior can lead us into understanding human desire for intoxication?
Oh, definitely. There's a book that just came out from the University of California Press called The Drunken Monkey, which goes into how many primates and monkeys generally are attracted to alcohol at a moderate level. And that is you know, probably the way that you know, human genetics have developed as well.
So I can talk to my friends about being drunken monkeys, can I?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, there's a lot of stories, you know, that aren't really controlled experiments in which if you take some chimpanzees, for instance, and give them an open bar setup where they can have any drink they want, the males in particular will put down 2 or 3 bottles of wine almost immediately. So there's a real attraction.
Evidence for the origin of the species, right? So,
Right.
particularly the male.
But it has very practical purposes as well. I mean, I mentioned the energy, but fermentation as a process, you know, helps to preserve foods and beverages. It gives special aromas that we're physiologically attuned to with our flavor and aroma sensors. So it's, you know, I think it's really an important part of life in general on Earth.
Yeah, great, thank you.
So, Bob, I'm impressed there was biology in that question.
And the only difference between biology and chemistry is the size of the molecule.
Have some more beer.
That's a good idea.
Oops, I've already had too much. So I want to start looking at the cultural side of beer. How would you say, I'll start with you, Pat, with this question as well. How does beer fit into the scheme of human cultural and social evolution? Because we've talked about the biochemistry, the chemistry, and so on. What about us and in terms of how we have evolved culturally?
Well, again, I think it goes right back to the beginning of human life, in Africa, where they would have undoubtedly been familiar with how to ferment different natural products. So it could be, different kinds of fruits, figs, dates, honey, of course, which is the highest concentration of sugar in nature. But then when we, speed up to the present and we look around Africa at all the many ethnic groups and peoples speaking, thousands of languages, one thing they do have in common is they usually have a fermented beverage, which is right at the center of their culture. So, and when I mean center of their culture, I mean, they even put the brewery sometimes right at the center of the village. And they are carrying out, various celebrations, especially worship of the ancestors, using a particular fermented beverage. Now, it could be a millet or sorghum beer, it could be a honey mead, it could be a banana wine, a palm wine. It'll vary from one region to another depending on what natural products they have, but the common element is that there we've got a fermented beverage. And when you then, look through human history, archaeologically and historically, just about every people on the planet have had a fermented beverage.
So are you talking about agricultural societies? Because if we're talking about beer, I guess we're talking about grains, we're talking about cultivation. Is there a connection between, say, beer and human beings becoming agriculturalists?
Well, they already had the ability to make beer right from the beginning. I mean, it doesn't have the yeast on it, and it has to have the carbohydrates converted into sugars, but we have enzymes in our saliva, ptyalin, which is related to amylase and so forth, which will break down the carbohydrates into sugars. And so once you spit it out, there will be insects and birds or whatever that are attracted to it that are carrying yeast, and that will start the fermentation process. If you have a liquid carbohydrate that's been broken down into sugars, that's going to attract a lot of interest by other animals, and they've been in touch with yeast, and they're going to inoculate that and make beer. So, I mean, I think this, is happening very early on, and then it's just a question of if you want to mass produce it. Now, once you start, wanting to mass produce it, then you have to domesticate the different grains in particular. Although you could, roots and, other parts of the plants can be used to make a beer. But the grains, once they're domesticated, all over the world, starting with, say, barley and wheat in the Middle East, rice in China, millet in Africa, corn in the Americas, which are still the basic grains of the world, you then can produce lots of beer, and you can store it, until you're ready to, take it and malt it and make beer. So that's a real incentive for people to settle down and have permanent places where they can take care of all their grains, so they can plant it, care for it, and reap it, and then make the beer.
And so in your archaeological work, I've read some of your book, which is fascinating. You talk about some very early settlements where people were making beer, and it was this very communal activity. So it wasn't, was it just beer for beer's sake, or beer to bring people together as well?
It's a very good social lubricator, alcohol. So it brings people together both at work and play. We know that the pyramid builders, both in Egypt and in the New World, were often rationed, fairly large amounts of beer and bread, which would keep them going. And I know from personal experience, as an archaeologist, if you don't have beer after a really long, hot day, you're going to have a minor revolution on your hand. So there was a case in Jordan where the local brewery, which was an Amstel brewery, had been closed down by some of the conservative groups, and all the archaeologists jumped in their pickup trucks right away and took off to get as much as they could before it disappeared. But I mean, in general, then people are, brought together, in these work activities. But it also breaks down the inhibitions between people and opens them up to new ideas. I mean, I think in a way that's how even our Constitution and Declaration of Independence were written here in Philadelphia. Is, after the long, hard day in Independence Hall, they would retire to the City Tavern or one of the many other taverns. There was one tavern per 25 people in Philadelphia at that time. And so you could really sort of open up, just let ideas flow, and then the next day come back and discuss them in a sober frame of mind.
And yet there have been time periods, I guess I'm thinking most recently in the United States, where prohibition was enacted, where beer, all alcohol in fact, was completely forbidden. So it seems as though we have this double relationship with beer, alcohol sometimes. It's a social lubricant, yet at the same time it can be seen as a kind of threat. So Roger, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that, being as someone who teaches students who are actually not allowed to drink beer yet.
Well, what I tell them is that we had prohibition from 1919 to 1933. There are various aspects of it still with us today, and they're probably about as effective as they were back then. The major beneficiaries of prohibition in the United States were probably the organized crime and the secret police.
And the Canadians. And the Canadians who've capitalized on it very well.
They actually had a certain amount of prohibition going at more or less the same time, on and off. They've even had prohibition in Australia, if you can believe that.
I actually do find that very hard to believe.
Russia has flirted with prohibition. It's one of those ideas that you would think by now we knew it didn't work.
Right. And what about a historic perspective?
From a historical perspective, I think because these alcoholic beverages are so enticing to people, you have to have different defenses, or people do build up some defenses against them. And I mean, it can be a genetic defense, which I think is the case for the flushing reaction that some Asian people have, in which they don't have the enzyme to break down acetaldehyde, and acetaldehyde is a poisonous substance which causes this reddening of the face, and so they can't drink too much. I mean, one way around this would be to, just drink there are examples where people just drink a little bit all through the day to sort of offset this disadvantage. But that could be a genetic response to the very heavy drinking that was done in China. I mean, we know that the Shang Dynasty emperors, for instance, drank huge amounts out of bronze vessels. Unfortunately, those bronze vessels had 20% free lead, so they were poisoning themselves at the same time. It's sort of like the Roman emperors, lead in the glass and in the water system. But you also have other, instances religiously that are prohibitionists, such as in India, where you've got Buddhism and Hinduism, which discourage alcoholic beverages, or Islam. But Islam is kind of a special case because, in certain parts of the Islamic world in the Middle Ages, you had what are called the Bacchic poets, like Omar Khayyam. So at the same time that they'd be railing against alcoholic beverages in another place of the Islamic world, these poets are writing this, very evocative wine and women and song, and
even today, poets like to sort of flirt with the forbidden. And,
right.
Yeah.
So,
but they were well accepted too in the Arab world at that time.
Well, wasn't, I may be getting this wrong, but wasn't the grape first domesticated in that part of the world, or very early on in that part of the world?
Right. That's the other sort of contrast here, is that the earliest chemical evidence that we have for grape wine is from Iran. And it's about 5400 BC from a site up in the Zagros Mountains where the wild grape, the Eurasian grape, Vitis vinifera, grew. And then we've got the situation today where you have to be extremely careful. They still do make wine in parts of the Zagros Mountains today, but you have to be very careful, and you can't bring cuttings back. Like, for instance, if we wanted to find out what the true Shiraz grape was from the southern Zagros Mountains, you're taking a big chance if you try to bring out some cuttings of that.
Oh, is that because it can be used to produce wine eventually, or just because it's forbidden to take out plants?
Well, in this case, I'm thinking it would be really, nobody's done a good survey of the grapes growing in that region. So if you wanted to do a genetic study of grapes from the so-called Shiraz, from the Shiraz region itself, rather than the Shiraz wine of Australia, which is really the Syrah grape of France.
Right.
Or are they just trying to prevent the export of their grapes to make sure that nobody else can make the kind of wine that they would have?
No, it's just a prohibition against drinking wine. And I would think beer is even less so. Now, the other point is that you can grow grains in certain areas, better than you can grow grapes, and then beer becomes a predominant fermented beverage in those regions like Mesopotamia or Egypt, where you can do irrigation of the grains.
Right. Well, thank you. I'd like to remind viewers to tweet your questions to us using the hashtag SciCulture, or send us your questions via Tumblr at chemaheritage.tumblr.com. And we have a lot of objects on the table, so I think it's time that we started investigating what we have. So, Pat, if you can start us off. You have some interesting copper vessels, and I also see lots of glassware as well.
I can start us off with Midas touch, which I'm sure a lot of your viewers are familiar with.
Do you want to hold up the bottle just so people...
This has the golden thumbprint of Midas on it, and it's based on a tomb that was excavated by the University of Pennsylvania Museum in 1957, in which the largest Iron Age drinking set was found, dated to about 700 BC. And this is the time of the Phrygian Empire in central Turkey at the site of Gordian. And the most prominent site or feature at the site is a large mound, going up 100, 150 feet high, even today, in which was a tomb. And inside that tomb was this largest Iron Age drinking set that had residues still left in some of the vessels. There's a funerary feast that was held for the king who was buried in this tomb, either Midas, there was a real King Midas, or his father, based on the dating of the tomb. And the excavators at Penn had the foresight to bring these residues back to Philadelphia. So it was like the easiest excavation I was ever on. I just had to walk up 2 flights of stairs, get the bags in which the residues were. They'd been sitting there for 40 years or whatever. And then we started the analysis of the residues, which turned out to be a really weird combination. So we thought at the time of a beer, made from barley, a wine made from grapes, and a mead made from honey. So you had a really strange combination that kind of made our stomachs turn, and so we had to enlist a microbrewer to do a recreation to see if this was even palatable.
Right, and we'll talk about that later. We actually have a video of a visit to Dogfish Head Brewery, and it would be interesting then to talk about the different tastes that you can find in these things. So,
but I've also seen a cartoon that we have of your work trying to put this beverage together, right?
A cartoon, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, actually,
you
can see it on the
that
screen.
was in New Scientist, Miracle New Scientist.
Right.
So you wouldn't want to be that fellow that's on the lower right there, who's maybe had a little too much Midas touch.
Yeah.
And these are examples of the vessels. These are replicas. These are not the real vessels of the drinking vessels in the tomb at Gordian. So we've got the smaller version, which maybe, I don't know, quarter liter at the most. We could use our graduated cylinder to test it. But this is the most common type, which you notice it has this indented area here at the bottom, which is called the omphalus base. But it works very well to wrap your hand around and put your fingers up in here and then drink quite easily. Now, this is the most common. Now, there were a number of these, I think 10 or 15, and this is for maybe the higher socially ranked people that were at the funerary feast with perhaps 2 liters. And there was also a 1 liter volume too that was used. So that, and there was a lot of other vessels that were very special, showing ram's heads, a whole ram-headed bucket that was used to be dipped into the cauldron in which the beverage was made.
And then you also brought another bottle with you.
Well, yeah, we can talk about that now too
Yeah.
if you want.
Well, Roger's got a bunch of stuff that he's going to talk about too.
Okay,
So let's,
yeah. Okay, I'll do some of my artifact show and tell here. This one is very special to me because although I couldn't bring the actual sherds that we analyzed from China, this represents the recreation of, or liquid time capsule of the earliest alcoholic beverage in the world, coming from China. Now, I'm a Middle Eastern archaeologist, so I was kind of shocked when I went to China and found out they were making pottery 10,000 years before people in the Middle East were. Pottery in China goes back to 16,000 BC, in the Middle East to 6,000 BC. But the pottery is what we really need to do analysis. I mean, sometimes we have residues, of evaporated liquids that we can analyze, but usually we take pottery which has absorbed the ancient liquids and held them ionically, in the fabric of the pottery. Then we extract them out and reconstruct what the natural products would have been. In this case, it was very similar to the Midas touch, except that rice was used instead of barley or wheat, which is, one's Middle Eastern, the other's East Asian. But it did have honey, and it did have grape, but probably a Chinese wild grape, and hawthorn fruit, which was kind of unusual.
So you can tell all that from the many thousands-year-old residue. You can tell exactly what kind of fruit or material it came from.
And then we assume it fermented because it was put into liquid form in these pottery. They're vessels clearly intended for liquids because they had high, narrow mouths to them, necks. And once you put these fruits and the honey into really liquid form, that's the ideal medium in which yeast can propagate and do the conversion, from sugar to the carbon dioxide and the alcohol. So this is the one I looked to, and we got a gold tasting award for this at the Great American Beer Festival several years ago, and the owner and the brewer at Dogfish Head, Sam Calagione, and I were there to receive it together. Okay. And then he presented it to me, and I took it back to my lab here in Philadelphia and set up a little shrine to this. I mean, I have the ancient sherds, also around it that we analyzed. And so every morning I come into my lab, I just, bow down a little bit.
So it is a real case of literally bringing history to life for people, tasting the history.
Okay. So Roger, what did you bring to show us here? We'll switch over to the technical side of things now.
Okay, well, what I brought was some stuff that is used today and has been used since maybe the late 1700s for making beer. When beer became a big deal, when beer became, you started making it in very large factories, in effect. The Industrial Revolution, you can almost say it started with beer. Everybody thinks it's cotton, but the first steam engines seem to have been after mines and things like that. When they started using rotary steam engines, first ones went into breweries, and they used it to mill the grain. So one of the big concerns that you have when you're making beer it's got two processes. You have to take a bunch of starch and make it into sugar, and then the yeast does the rest. Takes the sugar and makes it into a fermented beverage. But to get the starch into sugar, it's a little bit uncertain. you mix it with hot water, and the enzymes do their work, and that's where the malt comes in. So you at some point you have to figure out what you got. So the way that they did that was with a device called a hydrometer. Right? And the hydrometer has been known since for a very long time, but their application, the actual use of it, came in the late 1700s, and I thought I would show you how you would use a hydrometer. What I did is I brought some iced tea, because iced tea has a lot of sugar in it, and the nice thing about iced tea is it doesn't bubble, which is a problem when you're using the hydrometer, is that you have to get the bubbles out before it gives you an accurate reading. So put a little iced tea in here. You notice we chemists tilt the vessel towards the, well, it's a point of pride. We don't believe in funnels, that's for weenies. So we'll put the hydrometer in here. And now, if you can see on the stem of the hydrometer, there are numbers. And there's actually 3 different scales on this hydrometer. The numbers that are facing me, I've got a 1, and then a 1.1, 1.2, right? And so this is floating, I would say, at about 1.031. So 1.031 would be the specific gravity. Right? Now, you take away the 1, and you kind of get rid of the decimal point. We call that 31 points. And a point is about, 4%, 4 points gives you about 1% of sugar. So it's 31 divided by 4, so it's a little over 7.5% by weight of sugar in this iced tea. So now, you need a fair amount of beer in order to measure the specific gravity. In a brewery, they use ones that have longer and skinnier stems, but you could also use a device like this, which is a refractometer. Right, now this one, in order to use it, you have to kind of look through it, and there's plenty of bright lights here, so it's not a problem, but the viewers are not going to be able to see it. But what we have is a surface here, and we can put a few drops of the stuff on there, close it up, look in, there's a scale, and it gives us a % sugar based on the refractive index. What's nice about this is you're wandering around your vineyard, you pull a grape, you squash it on there, and you can get an idea of how much sugar is in the grapes, which is an indication of how ripe they are. And people actually use these. You can carry it around. You don't need any power or anything. And I also brought a refractometer of a type that is a table model. If we turn it on, and it gives you a digital display, and so
you've got from low tech to high tech.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little water on it to give it a 0. We only need a drop, drippy drop, and I'll push the 0 button. All right, so it knows that water has no sugar. Okay, and then we'll discharge the dropper and pull off the water, and now we'll take some of the sugar solution and we'll slook it in and out a little bit to get rid of the water, and we'll push the read button. 23.8% sugar. All right, so it's a very
I told you I
sugary
made a
sort of
concentrated
sugar.
solution.
Very sugary, but you see, it takes a second. You only need a drop, so it's pretty convenient. But this device works. It gives you a reasonable approximation, even if there's some alcohol in there, because this device is useless for when the stuff is fermented.
Want to try some Midas touch?
Well, we can put it on there, right? But it's gonna give us a number, but the number won't be right because alcohol affects the refractive index more than sugar. So the sort of correction is more than the real effect. So the refractometer is only good for either must, unfermented wine, or wort, which is unfermented beer. Right? But the hydrometer, which measures the specific gravity, it's okay. You have to make a correction for the alcohol. There's a way to do that. The other thing I brought was a little thermometer, right? That is, the old standard, which was invented by Fahrenheit, the mercury thermometer. Well, I didn't want to carry around the mercury thermometer in traffic and everything, so I brought a digital thermometer, which is, you just sort of push the button and it tells you what the temperature is. I mean, so if I grip it over here, it'll. So I actually use this in making beer, and but the thermometer was very important because the temperature of the water that you mix with the ground up barley malt has a big effect on the character of the beer. So they used to do it, but they'd stick their hand in, or they'd take hot water and let it cool down until they could see their face in it, and because the steam had gone down, and tricks like that. But when you start brewing on a big scale, where if you screw up, it's a really, really major disaster, and lots of people get fired, and the boss gets super annoyed. Then you need something to really keep track of it. So that's when the thermometer came in. It was only, 60 years after Fahrenheit invented it. The interesting thing about the temperature is that you can't get a piece of it and carry it around somewhere. So, weights were standardized from ancient times. Temperature, it wasn't until Fahrenheit made a thermometer that everybody could buy a Fahrenheit thermometer and measure the same temperature. And that's where they knew that, you need something about 160 degrees F.
So it would make writing recipes much easier. You could just say, keep at this temperature for a certain amount of time.
That's what nowadays they keep very careful track of, not only the mashing temperature, the temperature at which you have the barley in the water, but also the fermentation temperature. You ferment hot, you get a different kind of beer than if you ferment. In fact, ale is the type of beer that you get when you ferment above about 60 degrees F, and lager is the kind of beer you get when you ferment below. Now you need different yeast to do those, but that's the major distinction, is the temperature. So that's a big effect. And
what about the sugar? Because you talked a lot about sugar, but I'm not exactly sure what effect different concentrations of sugar would have. Did they affect the strength?
Well,
of the beer?
that's the big thing that affects the strength of the beer, is the amount of sugar. So the jargon of beer styles goes by what's called the original gravity, which is what we're measuring right here. Before you ferment the wort, you put in a hydrometer, you take a reading, 60 points, that's 1.060, that's a big beer. 70 points, that's an even bigger beer. About 44 points would be your usual sort of craft beer, and numbers down in the mid to upper 30s would be what you might expect for maybe your usual commercial beer. So it's a major characteristic in determining how strong the beer is, what the character of the beer is, and so that's. But it was. The hydrometer completely changed the way they made beer, right? The idea that they used to make porter beer out of brown malt. Well, they found out that brown malt was lousy. It didn't give you the goods. It didn't give you as much sugar, even though it was cheaper. So they started using pale malt, which is a fairly modern type of product. That is, they found a way to brew without letting smoke onto the malt, but they would use malt that had been gently dried, so it didn't screw it up too much. And then they would take a little bit of really dark malt to give it the color. And so that was porter beer became a different product because of the hydrometer, because you're selling beer in that kind of quantity. If you can save a few nickels here and there, it adds up.
So is volume really the driving force for technological adoption? It seems to me that brewers are early adopters of technology.
To some extent, but yeah, brewing became big, right? A lot of it had to do with the taxing policy in England, that the little guys would have to pay what effectively ended up to be a higher rate. Part of that was because it was just easier to tax one place. You didn't have to send people, and you didn't have to keep track of all these little ale houses. Mm-hmm. If all the ale houses would buy their beer from the big brewer, mm-hmm. then you knew who to tax. You only had to. You could have a guy in there the whole time enforcing the regulations. Beer to a government is a source of revenue. That is why Prohibition ended, because the government could no longer endure the pain of having the mob make all the money and them not make any of it.
So let me ask the question this way. Would you say that beer was the essential ingredient towards making humans chemists?
It certainly helped. It's a complicated process, but what you could say is that there was a huge fascination with ferment. And what we now call enzymes at the time was ferment. And nobody really knew what was going on. Everybody knew that there was yeast. Those people tell you Pasteur discovered yeast, right? Yeah, the nameless person that discovered yeast. Yeast, you can't make beer, you can't make wine without yeast. It's just there. It's lying at the bottom of the vessel, an immense amount of it. So people knew that yeast had something to do with it. It wasn't until 1836 or something that it was definitely known that yeast was a living organism. Now, what was interesting is that this was discovered by biologists, guys with microscopes. The chemists at the time were completely opposed to the idea. They ridiculed it. It was like modern day, radio political talk or something. I mean, they wrote little skits about it, about how these biologists were jerks. And I'm trying to think about why that came about. And I think it was because at the time biology was really an emerging discipline, and chemistry was a worked out, I wouldn't say a worked out discipline, but chemistry had established itself as a real science, up there with physics. Biology was viewed the way, for example, a chemist might look at, somebody who, majors in, well, I don't want to name any particular field, but, one of the less rigorous disciplines. It was, one of these biologists telling us how to do our chemistry. They were offended. And this one, it really set biology back by a lot. And what Pasteur did is he essentially reduced the chemist to rubble. And made all their arguments look completely ridiculous.
Well, on that note, I want us to take a break so we can visit a modern craft brewery and see how they do things. Let's see how Delaware Dogfish Head Brewery is making beer today.
At Dogfish Head, a batch of beer from grain to glass moves from our grain silo for our bulk barley, and then we transfer it into a tank called the lauter ton tank, and then you transfer out the sweet liquid from that into the boil kettle. This is where you add your spices the same way a chef would. The spice that you're going to add to your soup at the very least is going to be hops.
Take a smell of that.
In the case of most of our ancient ales that we brew, there are additional ingredients added. Most of these ancient beverages were hybrids between meads, which is a fermented honeys, or some of them have fruit. Post-boil, now you're sending that beer through a heat exchanger that brings it from the boiling temperature down to a temperature that yeast can survive in. Post-fermentation, you transfer that beer into a bottling or packaging tank, and now it's time to send that beer either to kegs or bottles and then out into the world for distribution and consumption. We were sort of the first brewery to focus on considering the entire culinary landscape for potential ingredients instead of adhering to modern beer style, militant style guidelines. So right out of the gates, we were brewing beers like Raison d'Etre with raisins and beet sugars, and chicory stout with coffee and licorice. And when I would take these beers to beer festivals in the mid-90s, I would sometimes get laughed at, or other brewers would get mad at me saying, hey, you're really screwing with tradition because you're not brewing, German lagers or English pale ales. So that got me on my own researching the more historic beer recipes that were out there.
The whole room smells like we just baked dessert in here. I get a lot of gingerbread, cinnamon, cakey.
It really helped Dogfish remind people that when we're putting these exotic culinary ingredients, we're not being disrespectful to more modern brewing traditions. If anything, we're the most traditional brewery in the world.
I've never actually seen or watched the process of beer being made like that. Yeah, it's fascinating. But before we get back to the beer, I do have a couple of Twitter questions for you. First one for Pat from Nancy Waltz. Was long-term storage of beer a problem for ancient civilizations?
The storage of the liquid, once it had been fermented, would be, because it's a low alcohol content, so it's going to spoil, fairly readily. And a lot of times they would make the beer in one large vessel, open-mouthed. They would make it in the same vessel from which they would drink. And so for that purpose, you would normally have to use a straw. And I give an example here, of an Egyptian tomb going back to the time of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, the monotheist, around 1350 BC in Egypt. And you can see that the person here is drinking beer with a straw because you want to get below that yeast and other materials that are on the surface. But the advantage of a grain is that you can dry it and you can store it for long periods of time, whereas fruits are going to go bad. You can't really preserve them that easily. And so you have to, like with wine, you're going to have to make your grape wine at the time that the fruit matures. With grain, if you have some sort of storage containers like silos, say underground, you can keep that until when you need to make the beer. And then pull it out, put it through the fermentation process, the mashing, and then you can drink it, usually within a few days.
So it's almost like the opposite of wine. You can store it for a long time before you make it, but once you make it.
And the alcohol level has a lot to do with that. If you increase the alcohol content, it kills off, the acetobacter, acetic bacteria that are going to change it over to vinegar. You usually would put other kinds of compounds in there that are antioxidants, like tree resins, that help to keep the wine from going to vinegar.
Right. So one more Twitter question. I think this one is probably better for you. This is from Jay Pakin. Oh, hang on. I think I have got confused. Oh, yes. How is non-alcoholic beer made, and what percentage of alcohol is actually in it? So give me the process of non-alcoholic beer.
You can argue that there's no such thing as non-alcoholic beer because beer is an alcoholic beverage. But there are essentially three processes. One is you can distill out the alcohol. So alcohol boils more readily than water. So you lower the pressure and you warm it up a little bit and you collect the alcohol, and then you make up the volume with water, and you can get the alcohol content to a few tenths of a percent by that method. The other two methods involve osmosis through semi-permeable membranes, and you can have set up a membrane that will only allow alcohol and water through. So you can reduce the alcohol concentration that way, and then replace the water, and you can get the level down to about 2% by that method. And then there's another method in which it's sort of similar, but you kind of let the let's see if I can remember how this works, but one involves the alcohol going through, the other is what? Okay, it's kind of similar, but I can't remember.
Sure, but what you're saying, there's no way to make completely alcohol-free beer. There's always going to be a little something left there.
It gets to be, to really take two materials like water and alcohol, which are kind of similar apart. You would have to beat on it to the point where it would probably be, either undrinkable or not worth it.
Right. Yeah. So that raises the question: why would you want non-alcoholic beer?
You can't ask me that. I don't want
Probably not this group at all.
The residues in our ancient vessels, of course, are non-alcoholic,
Right.
because the alcohol has been broken down or it's evaporated, and we end up with a non-alcoholic beverage. But like you say, it's not as desirable. I mean, principally because you lose the mind-altering effect, in my opinion. And I'm not sure why you would want to make a non-alcoholic beer.
But in fact, you infer that alcohol is there just because of the circumstances.
Right.
Why would anybody have a huge funerary feast with a bunch of barley juice or something? I mean, it's just unthinkable.
Well,
I think-
Roger, we missed the perfect opportunity to terrorize McCall with a discussion of separating alcohol and water and just what kind of distillation you'd have to run in order to really separate the two.
I think the more interesting question is how
started.
do you rate? I mean, most ancient people and people today are interested in raising the level of alcohol,
Right.
because of the mind-altering effect. And so, how do you do that in ancient times? I mean, you
Well,
can,
either at the freezing point or the boiling point, right?
right. So the freezing point is one way to do that,
So,
and get out some of the water. And
So what you're talking about is that if you allow the beer or the wine or whatever to freeze part way, and then you pick off the ice will have minimal alcohol, and so the alcohol is left in what's left, and so you can concentrate the alcohol, and that's your ice beer.
or get higher sugar ingredients that are going to produce more alcohol, and then distillation, the boiling point argument,
Right.
which develops apparently quite late in human history, but it's a process that was known at least by the Romans, but I think the Chinese maybe are the originators of the earliest distillation. We're looking at a project right now in Mexico where there may have been prehispanic distillation of agave juice. I don't know if you're familiar with tequila
That's
and
right,
mezcal,
right.
but there are vessels that look like they could have been used for distillation. So we're doing a chemical analysis to. The only trouble with distillation is you get all the volatiles going off, and you don't really have much
That's
left
the part
to
that you
analyze.
keep, yeah, there's nothing to analyze.
Well, you got to have a good condenser. Come on, we know how to do that.
No, but even then, you're still losing a lot of compounds that you might like to look for.
Yes.
That would tell you, about the beverage.
So talking about taste, so you've recreated this ancient beer, this beer that is roughly 2,500 years old or so.
The Midas.
The Midas touch. So in terms of taste, what does it actually taste like in terms of what flavors can you find in it as compared to...
In
it's got one.
this version of it? Well, one thing we did here was we didn't know what the bittering agent was. And it couldn't be hops because hops comes much later in Europe, maybe 700 AD. I mean, there are occasional hop plants and evidence from earlier than that in other parts of the Mediterranean. But we had to come up with a bittering agent to offset the honey and the grapes and the malt. And so I suggested to Sam Calagione that since we couldn't identify chemically, we might use saffron, which Turkey was very famous for in antiquity. And it just turns out that it's the most expensive spice in the world. So he said it was the most expensive beer he ever made. And he used only the best saffron in the first version of it that was served at this recreation of the funerary feast in 2000. So, I mean, you're going to get saffron, but you're also getting the flavors of all the other ingredients, the malt, the honey. You can use different kinds of honey that have various pollen that give special flavors. So in the first version, we used a thyme honey from Greece. It was very aromatic.
I wonder if there's a type of honey called mad honey. It's heavily psychoactive.
Oh, really?
Certain flowers that
The bees like?
it was actually used as a chemical weapon. They leave out a bunch of.
But it's interesting, all the things that get added, because I have a book in front of me which is written by a chemist named Frederick Ackham. And he published this in 1820, and it's a treatise on adulterations of food, and he was one of the first people to start a crusade on food and beverage, including beer adulteration. And he is well known for that, but his section on beer in some ways is quite horrifying, considering the kind of things that were put into beer at that time, such as opium, a fruit called Cocculus indicus, which apparently has a toxin in it called picotoxin, all sorts of things. But it also had other things that were illegal at the time as well that are now completely acceptable, like honey. You could end up in front of a judge by adding honey to your beer. So it's interesting how much has changed, because with this very old beer, you do have things like saffron, you have different flavors. And then it becomes completely illegal. And then only in the 20th century can people start adding saffron, honey, anything you want to beer. Hopefully not psychoactive compounds.
Well,
But
it is a local issue. I mean, in Bavaria, they have a very, very strict interpretation of what ought to go into beer. In parts of Belgium, I mean, sort of anything goes. So it's not, you know, it's not completely uniform. You know, there has been a lot of room for creativity. Now, before hops, they used a variety of some fairly strange items that, you know, you get sometimes medievalists making beer that doesn't have hops in it, and to the modern taste, a lot of these are fairly foul.
Yeah, but I should say...
Midas Touch is excellent, however.
Yeah. I should say that we just did a recreation of a Scandinavian grog, we call it, that has lingonberries and bog cranberries, and it also has these herbs that were used in the medieval beer. You know, the formulation of different herbs into Groot is called. And we were able to identify chemically in some of these early Scandinavian beverages in tombs in Denmark and in Sweden that the same medieval herbs are being used all the way back to, say, 1500 BC. They include bog myrtle, which is still used in aquavit. You know, has a very wonderful aroma and flavor. Yarrow, which is a little bit stronger. Meadowsweet, which has psychedelic properties, in fact. There was a much larger palette of different herbs, which can have just as interesting flavors and aromas as hops, I think.
Well, McCall mentioned the picotoxin, which doing a little research on that is listed as a performance-enhancing drug as a stimulant for horses. So it's banned in horse racing, you know, across North America at least. So,
yeah, well,
the interesting things you can find in
if you're a Viking or something, enhancing your performance might mean the difference between life and death, especially if you're sort of half lit in battle. But in the 1820s, what we're talking about is that the scale of brewing had come to the point where the brewers were tycoons. You know, they weren't the you know, guys in slouch hats that worked in the brewery, and they themselves, you know, did not necessarily use their own product, and so you know, they would put this and that and the other thing in there. Oh, it's only a little bit, you know, in order to cut costs, in order to evade taxes. Taxes was a very, very big influence all over Europe and probably elsewhere as well on the composition and the processes used to make beer.
And the other thing we should think of is that fermented beverages in general, you know, including beer, are the ancient medicine of humanity. They are, before we had synthetic drugs and all the rest of it, a fermented beverage puts these different herbs into solution and can be applied easily by drinking or putting on your skin. And if we look back at ancient pharmacopoeias, you know, whether in China, India, Egypt, Rome, the principal way that you put administer and put these into solution is an alcoholic beverage. And plus alcohol has, in moderation, beneficial medical effects too. You know, reducing.
It makes you feel better. No, well, the other thing is that in really ancient times, a lot of medicine had to do with, you know, sort of getting yourself right with the spirits, and to commune with the spirits, you needed psychoactive drugs because they didn't think the same way we did. So we had to alter our way of thinking to sort of match theirs. So you know, you would drink a lot of alcohol or eat some mushrooms or something like that. And it wasn't always the patient that had to do that. You know, nowadays, you know, you go to the doctor, he talks a bunch of mumbo jumbo, and you know, and gives you a bunch of pills. But back then, you know, in the ancient medicine man might himself take the psychoactive drug. He would commune with the spirits, and then he would channel that over to you, and you know, talk a similar brand of.
Well, on that note, I think we have just run out of time. I think it's 7:30, so. Bob, if you want to sign us out on a high note,
I'm not
with
sure.
a glass of beer in your hand.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. So thank you very much, Pat McGovern,
Thank you.
Roger
Cheers.
Barth. We're delighted to have been with you today, and even more delighted to be able to share a beer with you.
Well,
It was
Thanks
our
for
pleasure.
being here.
we'll do it again sometime.
Indeed.
Cheers.
Take care.
And thank you for joining us this evening from Distillations. I'm Michal Meyer.
And I'm Bob Kenworthy.
Good evening.
Good night.
Okay.